How to stay unshaken when people test you. Psychological Defense Guide. People test you more often than you think. Not always openly, not always aggressively. The test does not always announce itself with the hostile confrontation or the deliberate provocation. Often it arrives quietly in the casual comment that contains a slight edge, in the joke that probes just a little too precisely, in the interruption that was slightly too abrupt, in the look that lingered just a moment longer than neutral curiosity. These are not random social behaviors. They are assessments. They are the continuous, automatic social calibration that every person conducts in every significant relationship and every social environment they navigate. Sometimes it is a joke, a comment, a look, a tone. But behind all of it, there is always the same underlying question: how much can I push this person? What happens when I press here? Do they hold or do they yield? Do they have a defined character or do they have only the appearance of one? Is this person genuinely confident, or are they performing confidence that I can expose? The testing is not primarily malicious. It is primarily social intelligence at work, the specific social assessment that every person conducts, automatically and continuously, to map the social landscape they are navigating, to understand the people they are in relationship with, to find the structure beneath the surface presentation. The testing reveals what the surface cannot show: the genuine composure, the genuine boundary, the genuine self-awareness that holds under challenge rather than the performed version that collapses when the challenge arrives. This audiobook will teach you how to recognize those moments: the subtle test and the overt one, the manipulative probe and the innocent social calibration. And once you recognize them, how to stay completely unshaken when they happen, not through the performance of imperturbability, not through the aggressive assertion of your position, not through the defensive escalation that signals to the tester that they found the lever they were looking for, through the specific, built, genuine internal architecture that makes the unshaken response the natural expression of who you are rather than the effortful management of who you are not. 10 chapters, each developing a specific dimension of the psychological defense: the capacity to be tested without being moved, to be challenged without being destabilized, to be provoked without being controlled. The destination is the person who cannot be shaken, and the path to that destination begins with understanding why the testing happens at all. Introduction. The tested person. Being tested is the condition of the person who is present in the world, who engages with other people, who occupies positions that others have relationships to, who has developed qualities that others are curious about or interested in challenging. The testing is the social assessment of the genuine character that all genuine presence invites. The question is not whether you will be tested. You will. The question is what the testing finds. Whether it finds the genuine character that holds under challenge the specific, consistent, evidence-grounded self-concept and behavioral standard that pressure reveals as present, or the performed character that the challenge exposes as the performance it is. The development of the psychological defense is the development of the genuine character that the testing reveals rather than defeats. The 10 chapters that follow build this character layer by layer, beginning with the understanding of why the testing occurs and how it operates, moving through the specific forms of the test, the composure practices in the moment of the test, and the longer-term development of the identity that testing cannot shake. The audiobook ends where the tested person ends, at the specific psychological authority of the person who cannot be moved. Chapter 1. Why people test you. People do not test you out of malice. They test you to understand where you stand. The psychology of social testing is, at its foundation, the psychology of social calibration, the continuous, automatic process through which every person in every significant social environment is mapping the social landscape around them. The map includes the positions, the limits, the genuine characters, and the relative social standing of the people they are in relationship with. The testing is the specific behavior through which this mapping is conducted, the probe that reveals the genuine position rather than the presented one. The fundamental question that every social test is conducting is the question of position. Where does this person actually stand? Relative to me and relative to the social environment we are both navigating? The position has several dimensions that the testing maps. The confidence dimension is the confidence this person presents, genuine, grounded in an actual self-assessment and an actual demonstrated capability, or is it performed confidence that challenge will reveal as the performance it is? The limit dimension, where are this person's actual boundaries, the limits that they genuinely hold versus the stated limits they do not maintain under pressure. And the character dimension is the character this person presents consistent across conditions. Or does it shift with the social temperature in ways that reveal it as condition dependent rather than genuinely their own? Power dynamics in everyday interactions are the specific social mechanism through which the testing produces information about position. Every significant relationship has a power dynamic, a specific distribution of the social influence between the parties that determines whose preferences, assessments, and decisions carry more weight in the direction of the relationship. This dynamic is not fixed. It is continuously renegotiated through the accumulated evidence of how each party behaves under the conditions that reveal the genuine character rather than the presented one. The testing is one of the primary mechanisms of this renegotiation, the behavior that reveals the genuine confidence, genuine limits, and genuine character, updating the other party's assessment of the position and the dynamic accordingly. The person who holds under the test, who maintains the genuine composure, the genuine limits, and the genuine character without the defensive escalation, are the submissive. Yield is demonstrating the specific qualities that the power dynamic calibrates upward. The person who yields, who reveals the performed confidence as the performance, the stated limits as the adjustable preferences, the presented character as the condition-dependent variation, is demonstrating the qualities that the dynamic calibrates in the other direction. Why reactions define your perceived strength is the specific psychological mechanism through which the testing maps the position from the behavioral response. The reaction to the test is not the deliberate self-presentation that the managed social behavior produces. It is the spontaneous behavioral output of the genuine internal state, the specific output that reveals what is actually there beneath the presentation. The person who reacts defensively to the mild challenge is revealing that the mild challenge touched something genuine and sensitive. The person who receives the mild challenge with the genuine equanimity is revealing that the mild challenge found no lever, that the confidence it was testing is genuinely present rather than performed. People do not test you out of malice. They test you to understand where you stand. This understanding the genuine, compassionate, non-dramatic reading of the social testing as the automatic social calibration it is the specific cognitive foundation of the unshaken response. The person who understands the test as the calibration is not offended by it, not threatened by it, not pressed toward the defensive response that the misunderstanding as an attack would produce. They receive it accurately as the social assessment, to which the appropriate response is the genuine expression of the character that the assessment is trying to find. Chapter 2. The hidden nature of psychological tests. Most tests look like ordinary social interaction. The hidden nature of the psychological test is the specific feature that makes the recognition practice most important and most demanding. The overt test, the direct challenge, the explicit confrontation, the aggressive provocation is recognizable. The person who receives the overt test knows they are being tested, can prepare the deliberate response, and can engage with the full awareness of the dynamic that is operating. The subtle test is more difficult precisely because its surface appears to be the ordinary social interaction. The recognition requires the specific attentional practice that distinguishes the subtle test from the ordinary exchange. Subtle tests take several specific forms that are worth developing individually. The sarcastic comment is one of the most common. The statement with the apparent lightness of humor that contains the genuine edge of a challenge. The sarcasm allows the tester to deny the challenge if the recipient names it was just a joke. You're being too sensitive while conveying the challenge with the full intended force to the recipient who receives it accurately. The reaction the sarcasm produces is the diagnostic. The defensive reaction reveals sensitivity to the challenge. The genuine equanimity reveals the absence of the lever. Interruptions as tests are the subtle form of the dominance calibration, the specific behavior of cutting across the other person's speech before it is complete, which produces the specific social test of whether the person will hold their threat and complete their point despite the interruption, or whether they will yield the floor and allow the interruption to redirect the conversation. The person who holds their thread and completes their point without aggression, without apology, simply with the calm completion of what they were saying is demonstrating the specific quality of the person who does not yield the social floor to the casual dominance assertion. The person who yields is calibrating the dynamic accordingly. Tone shifts are the subtle test of the emotional contagion principle, the deliberate or unconscious shift to a more confrontational, dismissive, or condescending tone in the interaction, which tests whether the recipient's emotional state will be moved by the contagion mechanism toward the corresponding defensive or submissive response. The person who maintains their own emotional register despite the tone shift, who responds with the same measured quality of engagement they were bringing before the shift, without either matching the confrontation or visibly retreating from it, is demonstrating the emotional independence that the tone shift was testing. Passive-aggressive behavior is the test that operates through the social ambiguity of the plausible deniability, the behavior that communicates the challenge, the dominance assertion, or the hostility through the mechanisms of the indirection rather than the directness, the missed deadline that was convenient, the compliment that was framed in the way that drew attention to the weakness, the help that was offered with the specific condescension that the framing communicated. Each of these communicates the challenge beneath the surface of the ordinary behavior, and each tests whether the recipient will name the underlying communication or allow the surface presentation to substitute for the genuine engagement with what was actually communicated. The joke that measures your reaction is the testing behavior that most explicitly uses the humor frame as the container for the genuine assessment. The content of the joke is the probe. It touches the specific dimension of the person's self-concept, their position, their capability, or their sensitivity that the tester is mapping. The recipient's reaction, whether they genuinely laugh with the understanding that the probe found nothing threatening, whether they become slightly defensive in the way that signals the sensitivity was real, or whether they ignore the joke in the way that reveals they received the probe accurately but are choosing not to engage, is the diagnostic that the joke was designed to produce. Most tests look like ordinary social interaction. The recognition practice is the specific attentional awareness that identifies the testing element within the ordinary surface, the slight edge in the humor, the particular precision of the interruption, the specific framing of the passive-aggressive offer. The recognition does not require the paranoid reading of all social interaction as hidden testing. It requires the honest awareness of the moments when the interaction has a slight quality of assessment to it, when something beneath the surface is being measured, and when the response to it is being noted. Those moments are the tests. The unshaken response begins with the recognition of them. Chapter 3. The moment you lose control. You do not lose in the moment of the test. You lose in the moment of the reaction. The loss of control in the testing context is specific and precise. It is the moment when the test produces the reactive output that the test was designed to produce, when the defensive reply, the anxious compliance, the visible frustration, or the aggressive counter-assertion reveals to the tester that the lever has been found. The test itself is not the loss. The reaction is. The test without the reactive output is the test that found nothing. The test with the reactive output is the test that found exactly what it was looking for. Emotional triggers in conversation are the specific inputs that most reliably produce the reactive output in the testing context. These are the same trigger categories described in Chapter 3 of the Emotional Discipline audiobook: the dismissal that activates the wounded defense, the disrespect that activates the angry counter-assertion, the implied incompetence that activates the cover explanation, with the specific additional quality that they are frequently deployed deliberately in the testing context rather than arriving as the accidental byproduct of ordinary communication. The specific quality that makes the triggered reaction so damaging in the testing context is the information it provides to the tester. Every reaction to a test is information about the person reacting. The information provided by the defensive reaction is: this area is sensitive. This type of input finds something to grab onto. This person's self-concept in this domain is not secure enough to receive this type of input without the defensive response. The information is precise and specific. It is the specific location of the lever that the tester was mapping. Instant reactions versus controlled responses is the specific contrast that determines what information the testing moment produces. The instant reaction is the automatic output of the triggered emotional system produced before the deliberate mind has been consulted, expressing the internal state directly rather than through the deliberate assessment of what the situation requires. The controlled response is the deliberate output of the assessed situation produced from the partial or full regulation of the emotional activation, through the deliberate evaluation of the testing dynamic and the genuine requirements of the response. The instant reaction communicates the internal state. The controlled response communicates the character. These are different communications. and the testing context specifically values the distinction the tester is trying to find the internal state beneath the presented character. The instant reaction is the direct access to the internal state. The controlled response is the expression of the character that the presentation maintains whether the internal state is activated or not. How people read your behavior in the testing moment is the specific social dynamic that makes the behavioral quality in the testing moment so determinative of the social assessment. The testing moment is the moment of maximum diagnostic information, the moment in which the surface presentation is most compressed by the challenge and the genuine character is most visible in the quality of the response. People read this moment carefully, even when they are not consciously analyzing it. The behavioral quality in the testing moment is weighted heavily in the overall assessment of the person, more heavily than the same behavioral quality would be weighted in a non-testing context. You do not lose in the moment of the test. You lose in the moment of the reaction. Building the capacity to receive the test without the reactive output is the specific development that keeps the testing moment from being the loss. The capacity is built through the practices that the preceding audiobooks in this series have developed, and that the subsequent chapters of this audiobook extend specifically to the testing context. Chapter 4: Recognizing manipulation in real time. Manipulation works only when you do not recognize it. The recognition of manipulation in real time is the specific cognitive skill that denies the manipulation its primary power, the power that comes from the recipient's non-recognition of what is happening. The manipulation that is not recognized operates through the full force of its design mechanism. The manipulation that is recognized in real time while it is operating, before its effects have been produced, is the manipulation that can be engaged with deliberately rather than responded to automatically. Common manipulation patterns in the testing context have specific and recognizable structures. The first is the guilt induction, the behavior or statement that creates the specific feeling of obligation in the recipient, the feeling that they owe the manipulator something, that they have done something wrong, that they are failing a specific expectation, which is then used to press the recipient toward the compliance or the behavior that the manipulator wants to produce. The guilt induction works by creating the specific discomfort of the obligation feeling and offering the compliance as the relief from the discomfort. The second common manipulation pattern is the false urgency, the creation of the specific feeling that the decision or the response must be made immediately. That delay will produce a cost that outweighs the benefit of the additional time. That the urgency of the situation requires the immediate compliance. The false urgency is the manufactured version of the genuine urgency described in Chapter 2 of this series, the specific emotional pressure that the activation state generates rather than the accurate assessment of the decision timeline. The recognition of the false urgency is the specific examination of whether the urgency is genuine. What specifically is the cost of waiting 24 hours to respond to this request or to make this decision? Pressure tactics are the manipulation patterns that work through the social pressure of the implied cost of noncompliance. The implied social exclusion if the compliance is not forthcoming. The implied damage to the relationship if the request is not granted. The implied professional consequence if the expected behavior is not produced. These pressure tactics are effective because they are targeting the genuine social needs, the belonging, the relationship quality, the professional standing that the person has. The recognition practice identifies the pressure tactic as the leveraging of the genuine need rather than the accurate description of the consequence that noncompliance will produce. Emotional leverage is the specific manipulation mechanism that uses the person's genuine emotional responses, the caring about the relationship, the concern for others' well-being, the genuine desire to be seen as a certain type of person as the lever for producing the desired behavior. The manipulation through emotional leverage is recognizable by the specific quality of the dissonance it produces, the feeling that the genuinely caring response and the self-respecting response are in conflict, and that the manipulation is framing the compliance with its request as the caring response and the non-compliance as the self-serving one. Recognizing manipulation in real time requires the specific development of the pattern recognition described in Chapter 3 of the Emotional Triggers audiobook, the explicit mapping of the manipulation patterns that most consistently appear in the specific social environments you navigate. Once the patterns are mapped, the real-time recognition is the activation of the recognition in the moment of the pattern's appearance. This is the guilt induction. This is the false urgency. This is the emotional leverage. The naming creates the interval. The interval is where the deliberate response rather than the automatic compliance becomes available. Manipulation works only when you do not recognize it. The recognition is the defense, not the dramatic confrontation of the manipulation, the naming of it. The accusation, the explicit challenge to the manipulator's intent. The simple, internal recognition that the pattern is present, which shifts the person's relationship to it from the automatic response to the deliberate choice. The choice is what manipulation prevents. The recognition is what restores it. Chapter 5. Emotional detachment. When you stop taking everything personally, you become stronger. Emotional detachment in the testing context is not the coldness of the person who does not care about the interactions they are having or the people they are having them with. It is the specific psychological skill of maintaining the distance between the social testing and the self-connect, the ability to receive the test, the provocation, the manipulation, and the challenge without the immediate identification of each with the personal assault on the worth, the competence or the character that the reactive response treats them as. Psychological distance is the specific internal practice of creating and maintaining the space between what is happening in the social environment and the personal interpretation of what it means about you. The testing comment is a testing comment. It is social behavior produced by a person whose motivations include the calibration of the social dynamic. It may or may not reflect an accurate assessment of anything about you. The psychological distance practice is the deliberate refusal to collapse this distinction, to treat the social behavior as the direct evidence about your worth or character rather than as the social behavior that it is. The psychological distance is not indifference to the content of the test. The person who has built the psychological distance is still attending to the social environment with full awareness, reading the testing behavior, assessing the dynamic, identifying the genuine concerns beneath the surface behavior. What is different is the relationship between the assessment and the self-connect. The assessment informs the deliberate evaluation of the situation without triggering the defensive response that the identification of the test with the personal assault would produce. Observing instead of reacting is the specific behavioral expression of the psychological distance, the practice of receiving the social testing behavior with the quality of the observer rather than the quality of the personally invested participant. The observer notices the testing behavior accurately and sees it for what it is, the social calibration. The assessment behavior, the probe for the genuine position. The personally invested participant receives the same behavior as the specific challenge to the self-connect that requires the defensive response. The specific practice of the observer position in the social testing context is the brief, internal adoption of the third-person perspective. How would I describe this behavior to someone who had no emotional stake in it and no prior knowledge of its history? What would that person see that I am not seeing from inside the personally invested position? This perspective shift does not need to be maintained throughout the interaction. The brief adoption of it at the moment when the testing behavior arrives is sufficient to create the specific interval between the behavior and the reaction in which the deliberate response rather than the automatic one becomes available. Separating ego from situation is the specific psychological practice of identifying the distinction between what is genuinely at stake in the situation and what the ego is treating as at stake. The ego is the specific component of the self-connect that requires the social confirmation of the presented character that needs the challenge to be successfully deflected, the test to be visibly passed, the provocation to be effectively countered. The ego's requirements are the primary driver of the reactive response, the defensive reply, the aggressive counter-assertion, the covert explanation that demonstrates the competence the challenge implicitly questioned. The separation of the ego from the situation is the deliberate recognition of the ego's involvement and the deliberate choice not to be governed by it. The test is not testing the genuine self, the honest, well-evidenced, non-defensive self-assessment that the genuine confidence is grounded in. The test is testing the ego's presentation of the self-inept. The genuine self-inept does not require the defense. The ego's presentation does. The detachment from the ego's requirements is the specific internal practice that makes the unshaken response available. When you stop taking everything personally, you become stronger. Not because you become indifferent to the social environment, but because you become less available to the specific vulnerability that the personal interpretation of all social testing produces. The person who takes every test personally is the person who must defend against every test. The person who has built the psychological distance is the person who can receive the test accurately as the social behavior it is and respond to what is actually there rather than to the self-inept threat that the personal interpretation adds. Chapter 6. Staying calm under provocation. Calm is the ultimate response to provocation. The provocation is designed to produce the reactive response. It targets the specific emotional sensitivities of the person being provoked with the specific intention or the specific unconscious tendency of producing the behavioral output that the provocation was designed to generate: the anger, the defensiveness, the visible distress, or the submissive compliance that tells the provoker what they wanted to know about the person's genuine position. The calm response to the provocation is the most specific and the most consistently effective response available, because it accomplishes two things simultaneously that no other response achieves. First, it denies the provocation the reaction it was designed to produce. The lever has been applied and has found nothing to move. Second, it communicates, without announcement, that the person receiving the provocation has a quality of internal stability that the provocation could not access. The first communicates the non-availability of the lever. The second communicates the presence of the genuine character that no provocation can find a way beneath. Managing anger in the provocation context requires the specific application of the anger regulation practices developed in Chapter 5 of the Emotional Mastery Audiobook to the specific conditions of the deliberate provocation. The provocation is designed to trigger the anger. The anger is real. The provocation has successfully touched the genuine emotional response. The management is not the suppression of the anger, but the governance of its behavioral expression, the specific practices of the physiological regulation, the breath before the response. The awareness practice, the recognition and naming of the anger as the anger that the provocation has produced. And the deliberate behavioral choice, the response that the deliberate assessment of the genuine requirements of the situation produces rather than the expression of the anger that the activation is driving. Controlling facial expressions and tone is the specific behavioral expression of the anger regulation in the provocation context, the maintaining of the composed physical presentation and the calibrated vocal quality despite the genuine internal activation that the provocation has produced. The facial expression and the vocal tone are the most direct and most legible behavioral channels through which the internal state is communicated to the social environment. The person who maintains the composed facial expression and the measured vocal tone in the face of the genuine provocation is communicating through the most direct behavioral channel available that the provocation has not produced the loss of the internal governance. The specific practice of the composed physical presentation under provocation is the deliberate maintenance of the physical settling, the deliberate physical stillness, rather than the agitated movement that the activation produces. The deliberate maintenance of the normal breathing rate rather than the elevated rate of the activated state. The deliberate maintenance of the open, non-defensive physical posture rather than the closing physical tension that the defensive response generates. These physical maintenance practices are simultaneously the expression of the regulated internal state and the physiological input that reinforces the regulation, the body's physical signals of calm reinforcing the calm they express. Remaining neutral under pressure is the specific behavioral quality that the consistent application of the under provocation practices produces over time. Neutral is the specific description of the maintained composed presentation, not the enthusiastic positivity that would be incongruous with the genuine reception of the provocation. Not the cold blankness that would communicate the management of the response rather than the genuine composure, but the specific quality of the measured, calibrated, genuine engagement with the situation that the actually regulated internal state naturally produces. Calm is the ultimate response to provocation. Not silence, which the provocation can interpret as the discomfort it intended to produce. Not the aggressive counter-assertion, which the provocation can interpret as the defensive escalation it intended to trigger. The calm, the specific, measured, genuine engagement with the situation from the regulated internal state that communicates the most clearly and most durably that the provocation found no lever. The absence of the lever is the specific communication that makes future provocations less likely. The presence of the lever, even when its discovery is concealed behind the managed exterior, is what makes them more likely. The genuine calm is what the managed performance cannot replicate and what genuine development produces. Chapter 7. Strategic responses. Powerful people do not stay silent, and they do not react. They respond with precision. The strategic response in the testing context is the specific behavioral output that acknowledges the testing behavior accurately, engages with the genuine content of the situation deliberately, and communicates through the quality and the calibration of the response itself the specific character that the test was assessing, not the dramatic confrontation of the test, not the aggressive counter-assertion of the position. The precise, deliberate, proportional engagement with what the situation actually contains. The distinction between the powerful person's strategic response and the reactive person's automatic output is the distinction between the deliberate and the automatic, the same distinction that runs through all the audiobooks in this series. But in the testing context, it has a specific additional dimension. The strategic response is calibrated not only to the genuine requirements of the situation, but to the specific social dynamic that the testing behavior is part of. The response to the test is also a communication about the position, a specific update to the social map that the test was trying to draw. Minimal responses are one of the most specific and most underappreciated strategic response tools in the testing context. The minimal response, the brief, direct, non-elaborating acknowledgement or reply, is effective in the testing context for the specific reason that elaboration serves the tester's purpose. The elaborate reply to the testing comment is the elaborate demonstration of the activation that the testing comment produced, the explanation, the justification, the demonstration of competence that the challenge implicitly questioned. The minimal response communicates what the elaborate reply was trying to communicate through the sheer fact of its minimalism. The challenge was received, assessed, and found to warrant exactly this much response. No elaboration was required because no activation warranted the elaboration. Controlled communication is the broader category of the strategic response practice, the specific discipline of producing verbal output that is governed by the deliberate assessment of what the communication needs to achieve rather than by the emotional state's demand for expression. The controlled communication in the testing context is the communication that serves the person's genuine position rather than the communication that expresses the person's activated state. These are often different communications. The expression of the activated state serves the tester's purpose by providing the diagnostic they were seeking. The communication that serves the genuine position is the response that the deliberate assessment, rather than the activation state, produces. Saying less, meaning more is the specific quality of the strategic response that makes it the most powerful communicative tool in the testing context. The fewer words the strategic response uses, the more weight each word carries. The signal-to-noise principle described in the Speaking with Intention chapter of the Quiet Power audiobook. The additional principle in the testing context is the social information principle. The quantity of words produced in the testing moment is itself diagnostic information about the activation level. The minimal, measured response communicates the minimal activation. The elaborate, extended response communicates the significant activation. The communication of the minimal activation is the specific message that the testing context most rewards. Powerful people do not stay silent and they do not react. They respond with precision. The precision is the calibration, the specific matching of the response to the genuine requirements of the situation rather than to the emotional state's demand for expression. Building the precision requires the same practices that this audiobook has been developing throughout: the awareness that identifies the testing moment, the detachment that creates the distance from the ego's defensive requirements, the regulation that restores the deliberate cognitive mode, and the deliberate assessment of what the situation actually warrants. The precision is the product. The practices are the path. Chapter 8. Protecting your boundaries. If you do not define your limits, others will define them for you. Boundaries in the psychological defense context are not the elaborate contractual agreements about acceptable behavior that the popular discourse has sometimes made them. They are the specific, consistent expressions of the limits that your genuine values and genuine self-respect produce: the behaviors you will not accept, the treatments you will not accommodate, the positions you will not yield, expressed through the behavioral consistency that makes the limit real rather than through the announcement of a policy that the subsequent behavior undermines. The testing behavior is frequently the testing of the boundary, the specific probe for whether the stated or implied limit will hold under the pressure of the challenge or whether it will adjust to accommodate the pressure. The person whose limits adjust under pressure has demonstrated the specific information about their boundaries that the test was seeking, that the limits are negotiable. The person whose limits hold under pressure has demonstrated the opposite, that the limits reflect the genuine values and the genuine self-respect that the pressure cannot renegotiate. Assertiveness without aggression is the specific behavioral quality that the genuine boundary expression requires. The aggressive boundary assertion, the forceful, emotionally charged communication of the limit, is the defensive boundary assertion that the ego's involvement produces. It communicates the limit and the activation that the challenge produce simultaneously, which provides the social diagnostic of the sensitivity alongside the boundary information. The assertive without aggressive expression of the limit communicates the limit without the activation, the calm, direct, unelaborated statement of the position that the genuine self-respect produces from the regulated internal state. Calm boundary setting is the specific practice of expressing the limit from the genuine regulated state rather than from the defensive activated state. The calm boundary expression does not require the justification of the limit, the explanation of why the limit is reasonable, or the apology for the inconvenience that the limit creates. The genuine limit needs none of these. The justification and the explanation are the expressions of the uncertainty about the limit's legitimacy that the genuine self-respect does not contain. The calm expression of the genuine limit is brief, direct, and does not require the elaboration that the defensively held limit requires. Saying no without explanation is the specific behavioral expression of the calm boundary setting, the direct statement of the position without the extended justification that the defensive position requires. The person who can say no directly, without the explanatory elaboration that would demonstrate the activation the request produced, is communicating the specific quality of the person whose limits are held from the genuine values rather than from the managed compliance with someone else's expectations. The no that requires no explanation is the no that reflects the genuine character rather than the performance of a position the person is not genuinely holding. The specific practice of the calm boundary expression requires the development of the prior clarity about the genuine limits, the honest self-assessment of what the genuine values and genuine self-respect produce as limits in the specific domains where the testing most frequently occurs. The person who has not developed this prior clarity is in the position of determining the limit in real time, under the social pressure of the testing moment, which is the worst possible context for the genuine limit determination. The genuine limit is developed in advance, in the clarity of the non-pressured state, from the honest assessment of what the genuine values actually require. If you do not define your limits, others will define them for you. The definition by others is the gradual renegotiation of the limit through the accumulated testing behavior that reveals where the pressure can move the limit and where it cannot. The testing behavior moves toward the movable limit and retreats from the immovable one. The consistent maintenance of the genuine limit from the genuine values, expressed calmly and without the elaboration that would signal the activation the test produced, is the specific behavioral practice that teaches the social environment that the limit is immovable. The teaching is the protection. Chapter 9. Silent Strength. Silence communicates more than the elaborate response ever can. The specific power of silence in the testing context is distinct from the strategic silence described in the Quiet Power audiobook, which addressed the deliberate non-response as the tool for gathering information and controlling the pace of the social exchange. The silent strength of this chapter is the specific power of the deliberate non-response to the testing behavior as a communication about position. The specific statement that the testing behavior produced no reactive output, found no lever, and generated no activation sufficient to warrant the response. When not to respond is the specific judgment that the silent strength practice requires the deliberate evaluation of whether the testing behavior warrants any verbal response at all. The testing behavior that is met with the elaborate verbal response has been given a specific amount of the person's attentional and communicative resource, which is itself a social signal about the activation level the testing behavior produced. The testing behavior that is met with the maintained composure and the natural continuation of the interaction without the verbal engagement with the test has been given the specific amount of the person's resource that it warranted, none beyond the acknowledgement. Letting others reveal themselves is the specific information gathering function of the silent strength practice, the deliberate maintenance of the non-response that creates the social vacuum the other person will fill with the content of their own genuine motivations and genuine character. The silence after the testing behavior is the specific pressure on the tester to elaborate, to continue, to fill the silence with the additional content that the silence is inviting. This additional content is frequently more revealing of the tester's actual motivations, actual positions, and actual character than the initial testing behavior was. The person who fills the silence with the elaborate response to the testing behavior is giving the tester the diagnostic they were seeking while providing no information about the tester in return. The person who maintains the silence, the calm, composed, non-creative quiet that denies the testing behavior the reactive output it was designed to produce, is simultaneously denying the diagnostic and inviting the additional revelation that the other person's response to the silence will provide. The asymmetry of information favors the silent person consistently. Power of non-creation is the specific social dynamic that the consistent practice of the silent strength produces over time. The person who consistently does not react to the testing behaviors, who consistently maintains the composed, Calibrated engagement with the genuine content of the social interaction without being moved by the testing inputs embedded within it is teaching the social environment a specific and durable lesson about their position, that the levers are not available, that the testing produces no diagnostic, and that the effort to find the vulnerability in this person's character is not producing the information it was designed to produce. The non-creation is not passivity, it is the specific, active, deliberate maintenance of the governed behavioral output in the face of the input that was designed to disrupt the governance. The silence, in the testing context, is the specific communication that the disruption did not occur, that the governance remains in place. The silence is the evidence. The evidence is the power. Silence communicates more than the elaborate response ever can. The elaborate response communicates the activation it was produced by. The silence communicates the absence of the activation that the test was trying to produce. The presence of the activation tells the tester what they needed to know. The absence of the activation tells them something different, that there is nothing here to find. And the social map is updated accordingly. Chapter 10. Becoming psychologically untouchable. When you cannot be moved, you stop being tested. The psychological untouchability that this final chapter names is not the unreachability of the person who has withdrawn from genuine social engagement. It is the specific social quality of the person whose engagement is so clearly governed from the inside, whose behavioral outputs are so consistently the expressions of the genuine character rather than the reactions to the social testing, that the testing behavior stops finding the information it was designed to produce and progressively stops being directed at this person. The mechanism of the cessation of testing is the same mechanism described in Chapter 1. The testing is the social calibration that maps the genuine position. When the position has been accurately mapped, when the repeated applications of the testing behavior have consistently found the same quality of the maintained composure, the held limits, the non-reactive engagement, the genuine confidence that holds under challenge, the map is complete. The position has been established. The testing has done its work. The specific position that the untouchable person has established through the consistent expression of the genuine character under the repeated testing is the position of the person whose limits are immovable, whose confidence is not a performance that the challenge can expose, and whose behavioral quality does not vary with the conditions in ways that the testing can exploit. This position is respected, not necessarily like the person who holds the immovable limits, and the genuine composure is not always the most comfortable person to be in relationship with, particularly for the people who have been accustomed to the negotiable limit and the exposed performance. But respected, the assessment of the genuine character has been made, and the respect follows from the assessment. Emotional independence is the first dimension of the psychological untouchability, the specific freedom from the dependence on the social environment's assessment of your character for the maintenance of your self-concept. The person whose self-concept is primarily determined by the social feedback is the person who is most vulnerable to the social testing. The test that questions the self-concept touches the foundation on which the self-concept is built. The person whose self-concept is primarily determined by the genuine internal evidence, the actual demonstrated capability, the actual consistent behavioral quality, the actual record of maintained composure under the actual pressures that have been navigated, is not vulnerable in the same way. The test that questions the self-concept is directed at a foundation that the questioner did not build and cannot remove. Stable identity is the second dimension, the specific consistency of the self-concept and the behavioral expression across the full range of conditions that the social environment produces. The stable identity is the identity that the testing behavior cannot find inconsistencies in. The stable identity is expressed in the same character quality whether the conditions are comfortable or challenging, whether the social environment is supporting or testing, whether the outcome is favorable or not. The consistency of the expression is the stability. The stability is the unavoidability. Long-term psychological authority is the third dimension, the specific social quality that accumulates from the consistent expression of the genuine character across many testing instances over extended time. The authority is not formal. It is not designated. It is the specific social recognition that has been earned through the accumulated evidence of the genuine character that the testing has repeatedly found and not been able to shake. The recognition builds slowly from many small instances of the consistent quality. The recognition, once built, is the most durable form of social standing available because it is built from the evidence of the genuine character rather than the performance of the presented one. When you cannot be moved, you stop being tested. Not immediately. The social calibration is continuous, and the position established through the consistent quality of the responses to the testing behavior requires the consistent maintenance of that quality to remain established. But over time, across many testing instances in which the same genuine character is found, the position becomes settled. The map has been drawn with enough consistency that the calibration behavior is no longer updating it significantly. The testing reduces, the authority increases. The person who could not be moved becomes, in the specific social perception of the people who have tested and found nothing to move, the person it is not worth trying to move. That is the untouchable. That is the destination. And you are now building the genuine character through the specific practices of this audiobook and the series it is part of that the testing will find when it arrives. Closing. The person who cannot be moved. You do not need to win every interaction. You just need to stay in control of yourself. Because once people realize they cannot move you, they stop trying. The testing reduces not because you have defeated the testers, but because the testing has completed its work. The position has been accurately mapped, and the map shows a person who holds. Chapter 1 established the nature of the testing, the automatic social calibration that maps the genuine character beneath the presented one. People test to understand where you stand. The understanding comes from the quality of the response to the test. The quality of the response is what the preceding 10 chapters have been building. Chapter 2 developed the recognition practice, the subtle tests that look like ordinary social interaction. Sarcasm, interruptions, tone shifts, passive aggression, the joke that measures the reaction. The recognition of the testing element within the ordinary surface is the prerequisite for the deliberate response rather than the automatic one. Chapter 3 named the moment of the loss not the test itself but the reaction to it. The reactive output is the diagnostic the test was designed to produce. The controlled response is the communication of the genuine character that the test was designed to assess. You lose in the reaction, not in the test. Chapter 4 developed the recognition of manipulation, the guilt induction, the false urgency, the pressure tactics, the emotional leverage, Manipulation works only when unrecognized. The recognition restores the choice. The choice is the defense. Chapter 5 built the emotional detachment, the psychological distance between the social testing and the self-concept. The observer position that sees the test accurately rather than personally. The separation of the ego's requirements from the genuine character's stability. When you stop taking everything personally, you become stronger because you become less available to the specific vulnerability that the personal interpretation creates. Chapter 6 developed the calm under provocation, the anger management, the composed physical presentation, the measured vocal quality, the genuine neutrality that communicates more clearly than the managed one. Calm is the ultimate response because it denies the provocation the reaction it was designed to produce and communicates the absence of the lever simultaneously. Chapter 7 built the strategic response, the minimal response that withholds the elaborate demonstration of the activation. The controlled communication that serves the genuine position rather than the emotional state's demand for expression. The precision that weighs each word and deploys it exactly. Chapter 8 addressed the boundary, the assertiveness without aggression, the calm boundary setting from the genuine values. The no that requires no explanation. If you do not define your limits, others define them for you. The consistent maintenance of the genuine limit teaches the social environment that the limit is immovable. Chapter 9 developed the silent strength when not to respond, the information gathered in the space the non-response creates. The power of the non-creation that communicates the absence of the activation the test was trying to produce. And Chapter 10 named the destination psychological untouchability, the emotional independence, the stable identity, the long-term psychological authority that accumulates from the consistent expression of the genuine character across the many testing instances that social life continuously produces. The tests will continue. The social calibration is continuous. The genuine character that the testing finds, the maintained composure, the held limits, the non-reactive engagement, the genuine confidence is what you are building. The test arrives. You recognize it. You feel it and notice the feeling. You maintain the distance. You regulate. You respond precisely or not at all. You remain yourself. Completely. Unshaken.